why we're here. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, is currently in its 6th and busiest cycle. The full assessment reports from the 3 working groups are due from this summer through to 2022, but this cycle has already produced 3 special reports. So one of these is a special report on climate change, and this report was approved by governments in August 2019. And today, Dr. Eamon Haughey is going to explain to us how the significant findings from that report relate to the Irish context. So Eamon was a senior scientist in the IPCC Working Group 3 Technical Support Unit, which led preparation of the Land Report. So this is a considerable achievement, and he was also a contributing author of the report. And he's been involved in outreach in relation to that report at various UN and EU meetings, and he's also spoken to the Oireachtas here in Ireland about the key findings of the report. Eamon's broader research is focused on interactions between climate and agroecological systems, and he recently completed postdoctoral research in the School of Natural Sciences in Trinity College Dublin, and now he's an assistant lecturer in agricultural science in the School of Natural Sciences in Galway Mayo Institute of Technology. So I'll hand over to Eamon now.
Thanks very much, Olga. I'm just going to share the screen. Hopefully, is that working okay there? Oh.
Yes.
Good stuff. Okay. So yeah, so just to begin, really, thanks very much to the Royal Irish Academy and the EPA for the invitation to present these findings. I'm going to talk mainly about the work on this Ireland-specific report, but I'll mention a little bit about the land report from the IPCC as well, because I think that's relevant just to set the context. I'll try and keep this quite short and high level as well, and that hopefully will leave lots of time for questions at the end. So more details on almost all of these things is but probably better for questions. So just the first slide then really is just I suppose a few points about the climate change and land report from the IPCC. So this report was finalised in 2019, and it was the request of several nations, including Ireland, for a specific report that focused on land-climate interactions. And I think part of the reason for that is that previous work from the IPCC had shown that this was such a complex area that it warranted a report of its own, essentially. And the summary for policymakers is shown in the image there, and that's available at the IPCC website. If you haven't had a look at that previously, I think it's well worth a look if you have interest in this area. The very high level messages from the report, which distills down hundreds of pages of assessment, essentially that land is a critical resource. We rely on it for our existence, essentially, but that it's under pressure from human use and climate change itself. And although it can play a role in climate mitigation, there's a limit to that role because we rely on the land system for so many other services as well. And I suppose one of the findings from this report was that we need a sustainable land management approach when we're looking at the land system in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation. So the follow-on to that piece of work, as Olga mentioned, I was based for some time with the IPCC Working Group 3 unit in Imperial College in London. And when the report was complete then, my focus shifted in this research to look at translating some findings from that report into an Ireland-specific context. And I think this was a useful exercise in that it provides a high-level overview of several areas that may not be sort of looked in a holistic way commonly, I suppose. So the report itself is in the final stages of production. I think it will be available on the EPA website in a matter of weeks. And the structure of it is a high-level overview of land use and land cover in Ireland in Chapter 2, then an analysis of greenhouse gas fluxes, and I suppose the majority of the report then focuses on integrated response options and actions we can take. So it's a strong solution focus really. And so in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about chapters 2 and 3 and then finish off with some of the findings from the solution side of things. So land use in Ireland, it's something many of you might be quite familiar with already. I'll just start by saying that the map doesn't show land use. This map shows land cover from the Korean land cover data set. And the reason that I've shown this is just to highlight some of the spatial differences really that we have in land use and cover in Ireland. Land use data tends to be the data we use when we calculate greenhouse gas emissions. And at present we don't have a nationally available land use map, but that I think will change in the near future, hopefully. That will be a valuable resource. Just looking at the land use then, grasslands are the dominant land cover and land use, and as are the associated ruminant livestock production systems that there make use of the grasslands. Fairly evenly spread across the country, but what the land cover map doesn't show us here is that there's some large differences in the intensity of land use between the different sectors within grassland agriculture. Another unique, a relatively unique, I suppose, aspect of our land system is that the high share of peatland area we have. And peatland represents a very important carbon store, but unfortunately, most of our peatland is in a largely degraded state. And that has implications for greenhouse gas fluxes. We have a relatively small cropland area, but it's very important in terms of its contribution to food production and feed production. And you'll see on the map there in yellow that that's concentrated in the east and southeast. So a really important resource in terms of the soil as well that is suitable for that cropland production. We have relatively low forestry cover, although it has to be said that this has increased dramatically in the last century from a low level of 1.4% to just under 11% more recently. However, in the last few decades, this rate of afforestation has decreased. And again, that has implications then for our greenhouse gas fluxes. So there's a lot more detail on this in chapter 2 in the project report. That's just a real snapshot, I guess, of some of the key points. Moving then to look at the greenhouse gas fluxes and sort of trying now to relate the land use and land cover to greenhouse gases. This figure comes from the technical summary of the IPCC Land Report, and it's quite a complicated figure with a lot going on. But what I wanted to highlight here was how certain greenhouse gases are more associated with different parts of the land system, essentially, in a nutshell. So carbon dioxide, primarily associated with land use change, soil carbon and forestry, whereas methane and nitrous oxide, these are more closely associated with agricultural systems, also natural systems, but primarily agricultural dominated. And that's an important distinction when we come to look at greenhouse gas fluxes. So for the project report, I broke this down into sectors and analysed data from our national inventory, looking specifically at these 3 greenhouse gases. So in a one-slide summary of chapter 4, then, agriculture and land use change and forestry, we've used those categories because this is the way our greenhouse gas inventories are based, or structured, I should say, and that's the reason for that. Looking at the agriculture sector, on average, between the period 2010 to 2017, in Ireland that accounted for 28.8% of our greenhouse gas emissions, in comparison to the EU average of around 10%. And that gives an indication of the large proportion agriculture plays in Ireland in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions portfolio. This was primarily driven by methane emissions from ruminant livestock, and that in turn is dominated by cattle. Sheep obviously contribute to this as well, but cattle are the main component of it. Nitrous oxide then, this is associated with fertilizer use and soil management. It's also a significant part of the overall sector. When we look then at land use change and forestry, and I should say at the EU level this is a net sink of carbon, but in Ireland it's a net source. And the 2 main reasons for that are our degraded peatlands and organic soils under management, maybe for agriculture or forestry. That's a significant source. And then also our relatively low level of forestry cover compared to other EU countries. Although forestry is a significant sink here in Ireland, there's concern that because the rates of afforestation are decreasing, that sink might decrease also or be reduced in size in the future. Very high level summary, and happy to talk more about any of this in more detail. So just to move on then to the solution side, and this is what most of the report really focuses on. So this was based on the analysis in chapter 6 of the IPCC Land Report, and this figure on the screen here comes from the summary for policymakers, and essentially it summarises an assessment of integrated response options conducted by the authors on that chapter. And the reason the word integrated is important here is because this is one of the messages from the land report, that to have a sustainable land management, to make it sustainable or to achieve sustainability, we have to have an integrated approach that looks at food security, land degradation, mitigation, adaptation, all together, and we have to be aware of the trade-offs and the synergies between different options. So in terms of translating some of those findings into an Irish context, then I did an analysis of the 40 options to try and work out which of those could make the largest impact for Ireland, but I focused specifically on mitigation and adaptation. The outcome of that is that analysis, which is, I say, in much more detail in chapter 4 of the project report. 12 of the 40 options were found to be highly applicable to Ireland, and these are shown in the table here. We have options around demand management, so that's around dietary change, for example, or reduced food waste, agricultural land management, things like improved livestock or grazing management, agroforestry. We also have some options focused specifically on forestry and bioenergy crops. And then the final category there is on other ecosystems, and a key one there for Ireland would be restoration or reduced use of peatlands, and biodiversity conservation as well, important to mention that. So out of the 40 options, these were the ones I found that had the highest applicability. There's some notable absentees from the list, and we can talk about that in detail later if that's of interest. I suppose an important point to make here is that these options have the potential to be rolled out or scaled up. Many of them are already rolled out to some degree, but to be scaled up in the short term, potentially. They don't rely on, most of them don't rely on technological development, and I think that's really important, and that's one of the strengths of the land system, that many of the things we can do can be done without massive technological investment and the time that might take to develop those methods. So just to summarise then this overview, the land system in Ireland poses significant challenges to climate change mitigation, and I'm talking here about national goals. And this is because the land system that we have is a large source of greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's important not to underestimate the challenge that it is to turn that around. But there are significant opportunities at the same time to make change, and make change in the near term. And these might focus on the food system, but also the land system, or indeed other natural or semi-natural ecosystems. It's important to note, and this is one of the things I focused on in the report as well, was identifying where there are knowledge gaps. And for many of the response options, we simply don't have adequate data to do a very detailed assessment. So that's something that I'd hope will be addressed. And the other thing is that this report doesn't focus on policy. That was sort of beyond the scope, really. But I'd hope in the future someone else would be able to take up the mantle and have a look at the policy, because that's critical if these options are to be implemented at significant scales. So the final point, I suppose, echoes a little bit the IPCC report, that the land system in Ireland can certainly make a significant contribution to climate mitigation, but it can't do it all. And I think it's important that we take this integrated approach. It would be a terrible situation if we achieved our mitigation goals at the expense of biodiversity, for example, or water quality or food security. So we have to have a holistic approach, I think, to get the best outcomes. I'll just finish by thanking Professor Jennifer McIlwain in the Botany Department in Trinity, where I was based for this research, and the IPCC as well for for hosting me there as part of the land report. Thanks to the steering committee members for the project. We had a really collaborative process, I think, throughout, which was very useful. And of course, thanks to the funders, Department of Agriculture and the EPA for funding this project.
Thank you, Eamon, for this really interesting summary of key findings I get initially from the IPCC land use report, but then focusing in more on the climate change and land use in Ireland report. I think we probably all look forward to seeing that report, to see more detail there, but this is great.